The Repast Podcast may include detailed discussions about death, the human body after death, and the medical process that may be sensitive or disturbing to some listeners and viewers. Our goal is to educate and inform with respect and care. We encourage listener and viewer discretion, especially for younger audiences or those who may find these topics emotionally challenging.
There's a judge and a bailiff to hold somebody in contempt or put them in jail.
Right.
We're in the arrangement rooms. We're like, well, here we go. Okay,
Right. Roll
let
up
me
the
stop
sleeves.
this right now. Welcome back to the Repast Podcast. I'm your host, Brice Green, along with my brother, Antonio. Today, we'd like to talk about another special theme. We're going to go through funerals, finance, and planning for the inevitable. Back with us again, Miss India Ramsey from James Cole Funeral Home, as well as special guest, Jehan Crump-Gibson, attorney, author, all-around information superhighway right here. We're going to talk about Jehan's book that has just come out. It's called A Matter of Life and Death, How to Handle Family Affairs During Illness and Death and Keep Probate Court Out of Your Business. So let's jump into it. Jehan, good to have you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Go ahead, give us an introduction. Let us know about yourself.
Sure. So, Jehan Crump-Gibson. I'm an attorney, as you said. I've been practicing for 16 years. Seems long, seems short on some days, depending on when you ask me. But my primary practice areas are probate and estate planning, and I also handle some business and commercial work. So I run a small shop in Southfield, Michigan. We cover a wide variety of practice areas. So we've got 4 attorneys on staff doing multiple different things. Great Lakes Legal Group, co-founded the firm about 7 years ago now. I love what I do. This is my passion. And that's where the book came from, quite frankly.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask you. What, from being an attorney every day and going through all those legal processes, what made you say, you know what, I'm going to write a book?
Yeah, I think because I see the devastating effect that failing to plan has on families. Being in the trenches of probate court, and it is the trenches. I'm not over exaggerating. When you see the impact that it has, and you know that if someone took the time to just plan, they could have avoided it. That was the main motivation. So in talking over the years, anytime I do workshop seminars, I always tell scared straight stories, and people have said, you should write a book. And I'm like, I'm not writing a book. I'm not an author. And then it's like the acorn fell out the tree one day, hit me in the head. I'm like, I should write a book. So that's exactly what happened. It's a collection of stories in just regular speech. So we're not using big attorney words and overwhelming stuff that the average person can't understand to try to let them know why you should plan.
Very nice. Very nice.
So when speaking about the book, I know it's jam-packed full of stories and real life things that you've had to deal with in the courtroom and working with families. So what stories could you share with our audience that would kind of give them a good idea? Because unfortunately in our community, it's almost faux pas to talk about death, let alone planning for it and being prepared for it. So what kind of stories could you kind of scare straight our guests a little bit?
How long do we have? I think the common theme before I go into a specific story is just, a family's being torn apart, right? I can't tell you how many times we've been halfway through a probate matter and I'll tell someone, I know your mother has to be rolling over in her grave right now because of the way you all are behaving. Your siblings, you've grown up together, and these are not necessarily young, children or people. These are folks in their 60s, 70s, really acting out. I've seen people go to jail from probate court. I've seen people get judgments against them from probate court. They're stealing money. They came in right after dad passed away from the house, and before you all came to get the body, they're in the wallet, they're in the closet, they're going through everything already. And then when you get to court, folks want people to answer for that. He stole this. He shouldn't have taken this. I want to be made whole for this. So, I think some of I'll call them my star stories that stick out are, siblings that'll start out getting along, right? But mom or dad didn't have a will, right? So mom and dad they had a house, they had a few bank accounts, things of that sort. And some folks feel entitled, right? I was helping dad. I was the one that went over there every day after work when he was sick. He wasn't there. So I feel like I'm entitled to get more, right? And that's not the case. That's not what the law says, right? Everybody gets everything equal. I don't care if you didn't talk to your dad for 25 years, you still can inherit, right? So we've seen it to where folks will get into court, they'll start arguing, they will bring things up from Christmas in 1974, they will call each other names, all of the above, but it's gotten so bad sometimes the siblings can't even talk to each other. So we've literally had to go to the bank to handle information. It's like siblings there with their lawyers that can't even look at each other, right? And then we've seen cases last 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. That's a huge chunk of time when you're dealing with court hearings and processes and things of that sort. That's even outside of the arguing, right? So these are things that happen every day. There's not one specific story where you say it's worse here than it's there. Sometimes it is, again, jail. Physical assault, that has also happened at the courts. People get very upset about it. But by and large, it really ends up being a lot of strife that could have been avoided if mom, dad, sister, aunt, grandma would have just put her wishes in writing.
Mm-hmm. And on the funeral home side of things, what people don't realize is the law views the body as property. Mm-hmm. So similar to what you're dealing with in the estate property matters, that's how it views the body. So people think, well, I took care of dad for the last 10 years, so I'm the oldest, so I have rights to say what's going on. Like, no, everybody in Michigan, everybody has equal say. Now, majority rules, so if you got 4 siblings and 3 out of 4, then that's who's gonna have the control.
Right.
But the body is considered property. Mm-hmm. So people have to realize that, even though that's not how we present it to them, but when there's discussions or arguments, that's what we tell them, is this is how the law views it, and we can't go against the law or we'll be in court. Right. So this is what we have to follow.
Right. And they get mad at you.
Oh,
too,
yeah.
They call us.
Oh, yeah.
That funeral director. Okay. Okay. Calm down.
Oh, yeah. It goes the same way both ways. Almost seems like sometimes the same thing you described at the courtroom is what happens in the funeral home.
In the arrangement room.
Well, there's a judge and a bailiff to hold somebody in contempt or put them in jail.
Right.
We're in the arrangement rooms. We're like, well, here we go. Okay, let me stop this right now. We're kind of hands-on with it. But in that same aspect, India, I want you to discuss some of those surprise costs that people may not expect. They may not already know. There are some things people know about planning a funeral and whatnot, but talk about some of those quote unquote surprise costs that people may say, well, I didn't know I had to pay for that. Mm-hmm. Bring up some of those.
Death certificates. People assume automatically that death certificates are included when their loved one dies. They just think they get that just off of privilege, needing a death certificate. So that's something that we have to explain. No, that's a process. We have to file it through the county. It has to be certified. So there is a cost associated with that. They also think, I've run into situations where people think cremation is also included in the package price. Like, oh, the cremation is not included in the price of the casket and the price of everything that we discussed. And I'm like, no, that's separate. Look, our package price with all of our services are separate from the crematory charge. But that also goes hand in hand with people thinking that we do cremation at the funeral home.
Right.
So many people think that after the service, we have a crematory right there on site and it just happens right there. So that tends to be a surprise charge that people are not aware of. And then sometimes you have folks that just want to throw in other things like, oh, I thought the family car, the extra family car, that was 2 limos, not 1. So, people will throw in their own bonus services that are not included. But I often hear death certificates and cremation, they assume are included in our package.
And that's a lot of the law. I'm glad you're here because that goes back to the law. In the state of Michigan, it's illegal for a funeral home to own a crematory or a cemetery. Mm-hmm. That monopoly law is there and it's not possible. Mm-hmm. But yep, that's one of those costs. Antonio, what about you? What have you run into about costs?
I think cost would be things like the cemetery, opening and closing. So I often, when people have a plot they purchased, 20, 30 years ago, they just think that's it. Mom took care of this, dad took care of this, and everything is done. Mm-hmm. But some of the cemeteries have gone up so much just over the last few years. People can't even afford the grave to bury in the grave because the opening and closing charge is more than some cemeteries charge for, every whole package. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they have to come out to $3,000 or more just for opening and closing almost prevents them from using the grave themselves. So that's what we hear. And unfortunately, it's out of our control. It's a funeral home, but we have to inform them, opening and closing probably was not prepaid for at the time. So let's call the cemetery and let them pull the record and see, because that's going to be a big cost. And we have to go through that before we even make the funeral arrangements, because they may pick out something based on a budget at the funeral home. And if they've got to come out an extra, thousands of dollars at the cemetery, then they've got to rethink what they did here, because they got to afford that.
And depending on the cemetery, even the vault sometimes. Because you have to select the vault at the funeral home if it's not included in what you already pre-selected at the cemetery. So that's something that was a conversation I just had to have today, actually, about the vault. They thought the vault was already pre-purchased in the plot of the grave, and it's a separate charge. So that comes as a surprise too.
Yeah, I had that conversation as well last week. A family came in and they picked out a certain funeral package and said, okay, well, the cemetery's already done. That's done. That's taken care of. I said, no, let's call them right now.
Yep.
Well, what do you mean call them? Call them for what?
Yeah.
And that's when we came, okay, well, we'll talk to them, and got the price for the cemetery, and that opening and closing was almost $2,000. Going back, and a vault was not included as well. So we had to pick out a vault. And those are those things that add up, and those charges that add up that people don't really think about, and they don't really, are not prepared for.
And speaking of adding up, then you may have to run into a vault installation fee or an admin fee at the cemetery. So families dread you making that phone call to the cemetery, but when you make that phone call, they are thankful. Like, what? Yes, this is what it adds up to. So,
and that's what it comes down to.
Opposed to later,
Yep, that's what it comes down to of being the full service and providing everything for the family and being transparent as well. Let's talk about average funeral costs, low to high. Let's talk about that and throw those prices out there.
So it's going to depend on what type of side of the country you're on. If you're in California, it's going to be a whole lot more expensive than here in Michigan. So
as is everything.
I know people see on TV the average cost of funerals is $10,000. So you're probably, for just a funeral in Michigan, you're probably averaging $7,500. It's probably about the average. If you're in a larger city like Detroit, it's going to be a little lower just because of economic differences. Now, I don't know out in California, but I would bet your average funeral out there without any kind of burial costs is probably going to be $15,000, I would bet.
On the low end.
Yeah,
I
right.
would imagine.
But the most important part out of that is being prepared. So, Jehan, I know you could speak to that as being able to prearrange or set up things ahead of time where whatever you want is selected, whether it's a prearranged at the funeral home or you leave your wishes in writing and provide funds set aside for that benefit. But that's where it comes in, is explaining in writing, not just telling somebody, putting it in writing as to what your wishes are, what you would like, and here's how you can afford it.
I'm glad you brought that up. In Michigan now, and I know you all know this, and I think it was 2017, we can do funeral advocate designations now, and you can go into more detail, and that's the point in it. So do I want to be cremated? What kind of merchandise do I want someone to purchase? And when people come in and we do the funeral advocate designations, we go into that. We say, okay, well, what do you want, an imitation of life? That's one of my favorite old movies, y'all. If you want the horse-drawn carriage and all the things, and okay, let's talk about the monies that you have to pay for it, and then make sure your people can get access to it, right? Okay, I know that's another situation, but we have that conversation and people will come in and tell us, oh, everything, just like you said, everything's taken care of. And I'm like, bring the paperwork in and let's call back again. Let's call around there to Cole and figure out, because you think you paid for everything so that the kids don't have to worry about it, but you didn't. So that comes into our planning process as well.
Now, what was that called?
The funeral advocate designation.
Now, how is that different from a power of attorney, just for folks who may not know?
Wonderful question.
Check me out.
Process music to my ears. So power of attorney, and it's funny that often someone will try to use that after someone has passed away. Powers of attorney are only valid when someone is still living. As soon as someone passes away, they essentially are null and void. It's only for you to make decisions for someone who's unable to do so for themselves. So oftentimes people will call our office like, Daddy just passed, I have power of attorney. I'm like, that's fantastic. Yeah, that is wonderful that Dad got that, but what else do we have there, right? What else did Dad do? And so that's different from the funeral advocate designation that's telling someone this is the point person that I want to handle my affairs. Okay. These are the specific things that I want to happen. This is the type of service I want to have. I've had clients get so detailed, they wanted usher board too. I'm telling, listen, if you want that, your wish is my command. I want them to model all of my hats or whatever at the service, so you can get as crafty as you want, and that's a real story. You can get as crafty as you want, with your arrangements, and so we get as deep into it as people want.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And then as far as final wishes at the funeral home, how advantageous or what would you recommend to people? When do you need to get a pre-need done at the funeral home, or when do you just need to make sure that you have the right person set up on your life insurance and not minor children?
Yes.
Something like that.
Oh, you said so many words there. So many words. And we tell people, often you think when you get a life insurance policy, you think, oh, I want to provide for my kids or whoever it is. So you throw the minor on there, not knowing that that's going to force someone to have to go to probate court, right? Or you have accounts, oh, I put the money for the policy, I put it in my bank accounts. I didn't need insurance because, there's some from the school of thought that they didn't believe in life insurance or burial policies, and that's their purview. But if you put the money in a bank account that someone else isn't on, or they're not beneficiary of, they're not going to be able to access those funds. And they're showing up to you all like, I know Dad left money in an account. And it's like, okay, how do we get to it? And so you can certainly petition probate court to try to get access to those things for burial purposes, but that's another process that you have to go through, right? You're having most people, technically you don't have to have a lawyer in probate, but it's overwhelming. Probate court is not a second nature thing like, oh, this is probably like this. It's the opposite of what you think probably in most instances. So normally you have to find a lawyer to help you. You're already grieving, right? It's a stressful time. So why do we even want to put our relatives through that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What would you say is the biggest benefit of having a trust?
Yes. So trust, I compare trust to a flower vase, right? And as long as your assets, that's your house, your car, your bank account, your stock, your business, anything that you have is a flower. As long as we put the flower in the vase, they get to avoid probate court. So if I have a client that has a house, a life insurance policy, and a few bank accounts, and we make sure those are in the trust, when something happens to them, the check gets cut to the trust, and whoever is appointed as the trustee, that just means the person that's going to manage, they can go ahead, access the money, and pay for whatever they need to pay for. So it's a beautiful tool to have. Everyone doesn't need them, but folks with minor children, if you want to try to control money after you're gone, some of us are control freaks, that's guilty. But if you don't want your kid to receive all the money at 18, if you want to space it out, you may have an adult child with special needs and you don't want to interrupt their government benefits or something like that. Or you may want to keep things in the family and control what happens to a specific house or something. That's the best way to do it without the court being involved, is through a trust.
Okay.
Very good. I am so glad that these all questions are coming up, because this is something that we, a lot of time as funeral directors, get asked by the family while we're in the office, and we have to try to break it down and explain it. But of course, like you said, you're grieving. So now we're explaining legal processes through tears. And it doesn't go over well. A lot of times it's not even received because of the grief. And then maybe 30 minutes after they leave the funeral home, they're calling back. What did you say again?
Right.
Exactly.
And they're going through it that way.
Right.
Yep.
And we're not attorneys. So, we have to put a funeral director hat and an attorney hat. So we're trying to explain arrangements and, everything else all in one. So it's not received the same as if you go and sit with an attorney, or if you have your affairs in place already when you're not grieving. That process is that much easier when you come and sit with us.
Right.
And speaking of those affairs, India, let's try to touch on or give people some information about what you can do if you have, honestly, no insurance policy, no bank account. There is no money, but I got to take care of mom. I got to take care of dad, but I have little to nothing. What are some of those options?
I say utilize your resources. There are resources out there for people who don't have life insurance. if your loved one is a veteran, there are many resources available to you. There's reimbursement for veterans. There's also burial that the Veteran Affairs takes care of for an honorable veteran. So definitely using your resources. Department of Human Services will assist with a burial and cremation service. So it's about educating yourself, and it's really about us educating the families, because a lot of times when they come in, they will be honest and say, I'm not working with anything at all. So what should I do? And many people don't want to do a direct cremation. You know, they want to know what their options are. I have a little bit to have a service, so I want to have, what's your least expensive service, but I want to do burial. Well, hey, if your loved one is a veteran, let me walk you through this process. The burial is taken care of with the honorable veteran. So it's a matter on our end of educating our families, but there are resources available to you, and Department of Human Services is a resource, as well as utilizing Veteran Affairs as well.
And speaking of that cremation process, a lot of people, they don't really know that price difference. Mm-hmm. So they kind of say, well, it don't matter. I got to pay this anyway. Mm-hmm. But it does matter, and give a roundabout figure of how much cremation is less expensive than a traditional funeral service with burial.
So like we just discussed, an average burial here in Michigan, we're looking at right around with a service and burial, $7,500 around and about. With a cremation, it depends on what kind of cremation you want to have. If you want to have a service and cremation, on average, you're looking at right around $4,500. And I'm speaking on behalf of on the average of Michigan. Mm-hmm. I'm talking as far as locally. So cremation with a service, you're looking at right around $4,500 opposed to the $7,500. If you're looking to have, a direct cremation with a memorial service, you're averaging right around $2,500. So it is substantially cheaper to have a cremation opposed to a burial. But again, there are resources available to you.
And then it depends to what you want to do with the ashes, because if you'd have a service and then followed by cremation, mm-hmm. but then with the ashes, if you're going to go to a cemetery and purchase a niche to have them placed in, that could be almost expensive as purchasing a grave. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can get a $2,000 urn if you wanted something custom or elaborate. Mm-hmm. So you really have to think on what it is that you truly want, what your wishes are. And to all the listeners and viewers now, you're listening to this. So you have the option now to make the decision to put things in writing and put things in place to pay for what it is that you would like.
Exactly. And don't wait until after and have it hit you at once. Now, Jehan, I do want to touch on that. I want to go to you so that we can speak about what are some of those financial obligations mm-hmm. that people don't even think about, they're not even prepared for, but they're gonna hit you after death.
Yeah. So I'd say obviously funeral costs, right? Or your final wishes is what I will call them. That's the first part of it. I think after that, after you put your loved one away, I think the biggest cost is associated with property that someone has. So like real estate, right? So let's say, and we're in Michigan, so we know the majority of the year is cold. Mm-hmm. And it's very cold and sometimes. So in those cases, you have to worry about making sure we have the utilities on so the pipes don't freeze and then cause a bigger issue in the house. Even if the house was paid off and there wasn't a mortgage, taxes are still going to be due. So are we paying the taxes? And that's what happens a lot. Folks don't anticipate, I got to keep the ship going. Mm-hmm. Even if this is something that I'm going to inherit, I got to pay to maintain it until I can get it. So you got to keep the water on there. You got to keep the electricity on. Not saying that the heat has to be super high, but you have to maintain it. So that would be what I say is the thing that surprises people the most. They'll call us and go, well, who's going to pay for that? And I'm like, well, how much money you got? That's the first. Because especially if mom and dad or whoever passed away left money in accounts that you're not on, and then we have to go to probate court, you don't have access to those things. So a lot of people will have to front those costs. Oftentimes we're seeking reimbursements for funeral costs for people, filing claims for that. So you'll have to front the cost until you can go through the probate process and get reimbursed. Some folks have it, some folks don't.
Now, speaking of funeral costs and bank accounts, let's touch on paying for mom's funeral with her debit card or credit card after she's passed away.
That's a popular one.
Because many times we get offered, oh, this is mom's card. Are you on the account? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Girl, you know you're not on that account. That happens often.
Okay.
That happens often. Folks will call us and say, I tell them, obviously, you're gonna do what you're gonna do. The proper way to handle things is obviously for you to use what resources are legally available to you now and then get reimbursed later. But, what folks end up doing, they'll go ahead, I got access, or I was at the credit union too, so I'm going to transfer this money into this account and pay from here. And that works until it doesn't, right? So it may be if you're an only child and we can maybe it's not that big of a deal, especially if you were able to prove that the money was spent on the funeral. So a lot of times what people will say, well, why is it a big deal? Like, it's not like I took the money and took a trip to Hawaii. I paid for the funeral. Well, you kind of did things out of course. But sometimes what that does, especially when you have siblings, when there's strife and maybe one isn't trusting the other, that gives them the fuel to put on the fire. Well, you see, they already transferred that money from mom's account. What else are they doing? And then that person runs off and gets their own lawyer or whatever. And then it ends up being an explosion.
And earlier you mentioned about trust. Explain a little bit the difference between an irrevocable and a revocable.
Yes. So the difference between the two is one can be changed at any time during your lifetime while you are of sound mind. The other one, it's almost impossible to change. So the one that's almost impossible to change, though, it has some great benefits. It shields your assets from creditors. It reduces your taxable estate. So that's less taxes that the estate would have to pay. Right now, the threshold is still pretty high for estate tax. I know I'm below it. If I wasn't, I wouldn't be on this podcast right now. I'd be on a yacht. So it's still pretty high for an individual. It's 13 point, et cetera, million right now. And that's due to sunset at the end of 2025. We don't know what's going to happen. So most estates are not subject to it, but they could be. When I first started practicing, a lot of estates that I dealt with were. So the beauty of the irrevocable trust is that you can reduce any, tax liability and also shield from creditors, but you don't get the flexibility to do what you need to do with your assets. So people will call us like, yeah, I want one of those irrevocable trusts. Like, give me one of them. And it's like, okay, well, let's talk about what your assets are. Well, I have a house. Okay, are you living in it? Yes. Do you have a mortgage on it? Yes. Okay. And you have this. Do you need to access that? Right? And if the answer is yes, we can't set that up for you. Now, eventually, as people's assets grow, we may have both. Right? We may start out with a revocable trust. And then when we grow up, I hope to be able to do that one day. And then when we grow up, we may separate assets out into another one. So even though the irrevocable one has benefits that everybody thinks it's a no-brainer, let me get them, it's so stringent for you to be able to make a change to the terms. And you're completely relinquishing your interest in the asset. So obviously, you can't do that if you have a mortgage, because Chase or whoever is going to be like, oh, let me get all of that loan right now. So, you have to be careful about those things.
Now, also along those lines, you touched on a little bit earlier, but the power of attorney, how that ceases at death. What about in those situations where you said you're naming a funeral representative? Talk about how that is a legal binding decision that somebody would make to say if they're making their neighbor their funeral representative and appointing them, that's who's running the show now.
Yeah. Oh, we see so many of those challenges in court, right? Especially when you're dealing with folks that are aging. The first thing is to say a common challenge in probate court is that this person didn't have the capacity, the legal capacity. So she didn't know what she was doing when she signed that funeral advocate designation and said that Mary Jo could be the one to make decisions. She would never do that. She would name me. Meanwhile, y'all don't know, she really knew what she was doing and she really didn't want you. But that's, most people will pick some don't, but most people will pick who they trust and who they think can do the job, right? So if I know Mary Jo's responsible, we've been neighbors for 50 years. She's always done this, she's done that. She's been smart with her money, so I think she would be the responsible one, and I don't want that burden to be on my kids. That's how sometimes some folks will think of it. But kids will get mad and they will try to challenge those things, whether it's power of attorney or funeral advocate designations. If they think someone is named that shouldn't be, they will absolutely try to challenge the documents in probate court.
Now, does the funeral advocate have to also be the beneficiary in the life insurance as well?
Not necessarily. So it depends on what we have going on. If somebody has a trust, then absolutely not, right? But if I'm dealing, let's say I have a widow, right? And she has an apartment and an insurance policy and a checking account. I'm not going to save up or set up a trust for her, right? So maybe we may want to align those things so they work together. So if I have Bob named as the funeral advocate, maybe Bob then is the one that's listed on the insurance policy, but it depends on her wishes and what the family wants. One of my favorite scared straight stories that happens often, it's in the book, but it happens so much, that's just one sample, is when you name Bubba on the insurance policy thinking he's gonna do the right thing. Bubba will not do the right thing. I actually remember a call that we got maybe about 6-7 years ago. There was a young lady, dad passed, and most of his stuff didn't have beneficiaries on it. I think his wife had passed years before. And there was one policy that had one of the daughters on it. This was a younger daughter. There were some different family dynamics. Not everybody had the same parents. So there were some ins and outs, and she found out she was the beneficiary in the policy. So siblings call her over like, hey, let's go up to the funeral home and, whatever else. So they go up to one of the funeral homes, and she basically looked at them and was like, I want to use who my mom's people use. And if we don't, I'm not paying for anything. And she walked out the door. What could they do about it? Absolutely nothing. So they were left scrambling. Obviously I consulted with them. I don't know what ended up happening after that, but they were left scrambling to pay to bury dad where they wanted to, right? Because they didn't have access to his other money. And she rode off into the sunset with that $100,000 death benefit.
And we have that happen all the time, where people will come in and the beneficiary is someone, but they either want another funeral home or they want to run things their way. And sometimes you have to have that hard conversation with families and say, listen, if you don't have anything to contribute to this and you're depending on this,
you gotta play the game.
Then now it's not going to affect, because it could be a girlfriend. Well, I want her to get the house. That has nothing to do with the estate. This is the policy. But if that's the beneficiary, she could walk away with all of it right now and be into the sunset.
100%.
And that's what a lot of families think, is they'll come into the funeral home and say, oh, well, I don't know who the beneficiary is, but you can get your money, right? You'll be okay. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. We have to have the named beneficiary to sign the assignment form to give us permission to access. We just can't go into policy and say, well, I think I'll take this much, thank you.
You know what, I'm gonna take 20,000.
That's about right. But I mean, people just don't realize that, and so many people just think that we just get it off the top, no matter what. Like it's gonna come to us no matter what. But no, the named beneficiary has to be the one to sign the paperwork.
And that's so important to be speaking about this, just because of the fact that a lot of questions that we get too, I know I get it all the time, is, well, I don't care who the beneficiary is. They have to use this to pay for the funeral. No, they don't.
No, they do not.
This is not a mandatory death benefit or a mandatory funeral insurance. This is life insurance. And whoever the beneficiary is, they can use it however they deem necessary.
And that also comes as a surprise in the arrangement conference also, when the children are thinking they're the beneficiary, so they're signing the paperwork, and then when you get that verification back, it's the boyfriend or it's the name, it's somebody who they absolutely are like, what? No, that has to be wrong. Like, but this is the information that we have, so are you covering out of pocket, or are we contacting this person to sign? So that's a surprise that tends to ruffle feathers, for sure.
We've just scratched the surface of the financial side of funerals, uncovering the true costs, dispelling notions of surprise fees, and how some families plan ahead with trust and prearrangements. But the money talk doesn't stop there. In part 2, we'll get into the bigger picture, how estate planning, wills, and generational wealth all come into play. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.